Imagine standing in a pit of sand so hot it burns through the soles of your feet. Above you, 50,000 Romans are screaming. Not words, just noise. The sound of a crowd that has stopped seeing human beings and started seeing entertainment. You are holding a sword that does not belong to you. Across the sand, 10 feet away, stands a man you have never met. He has a wife somewhere, maybe children. You do not know his name. You will never know his name. In approximately 30 seconds, one of you will be dead, and the crowd will cheer either way. This was not war. This was not justice. This was Tuesday afternoon in the Roman Republic. The most powerful civilization on Earth had built an entire industry around watching men kill each other for fun. And at the center of that industry, chained, branded, and owned like livestock, was a man Rome would spend 5 centuries trying to erase from its own history. His name was Spartacus. Here is the problem with everything you think you know about him. The version that survived, the noble rebel, the freedom fighter with the soaring speech, that is not history. That is a story Rome permitted to exist because it was safe, because it made Spartacus sound like an idealist, like a dreamer. Dreamers do not almost destroy empires. What Rome actually faced was something it could not admit out loud. Not then, not ever. It had built a machine that ran on human bodies, on chains, on sand and blood and screaming crowds, and that machine had produced something it never intended. A man who understood it completely, who had survived every layer of it, who had been ground down to nothing and had come out the other side not broken, but sharpened. Rome did not almost fall to a slave revolt. Rome almost fell to the perfect product of Roman civilization, turning around and looking its creator in the eye. Before we follow Spartacus into the mountains above Capua and watch a single escaped gladiator build an army that made 8 Roman legions run, drop a comment right now. Tell me where you are watching from, your city and your country. And if you have not subscribed yet, take 1 second. Help us keep pulling up the stories history tried to bury alive. Before you can understand Spartacus, you have to understand the world that owned him. Not the Rome of marble temples and philosophical debates, not the Rome of senators in white togas discussing the nature of justice. The other Rome, the one that made all of that possible. At its peak, the Roman Republic ran on slaves the way a modern city runs on electricity, quietly, invisibly, so embedded into daily life that most Romans never stopped to think about it. Slaves cooked their food, built their roads, harvested their grain, raised their children, cleaned their bodies, and died in their minds. Conservative estimates suggest that by the late Republic, slaves made up somewhere between 30 and 40% of the entire Italian population. In some regions, the number was higher. In Sicily, entire provinces existed where free men were the minority and the enslaved were everywhere. That is not a labor market. That is an occupation, and Rome knew exactly what it had built. The fear lived underneath everything, quiet, constant, never spoken aloud at dinner parties, but present in every law, every punishment, every public spectacle of violence. Because the Romans understood a simple arithmetic that kept the ruling class awake at night. There were more of them than there were of us. There had always been more of them. And if they ever stopped being afraid long enough to look around and count, the entire structure would collapse before sunrise. So Rome made fear its primary administrative tool. The punishments written into Roman law for slave rebellion were not designed to deter. They were designed to annihilate the very idea of resistance before it could form a single coherent thought. If a slave killed his master, every slave in that household was executed, every single one, regardless of involvement, regardless of age. The logic was coldly explicit. Collective terror was cheaper than individual justice. You did not need to prove guilt, you needed to prove consequence. Slaves were prohibited from carrying weapons. They could not gather in groups without supervision. They could not travel without documentation. They could not testify in court except under torture, because Roman law held that a slave's words were only reliable when extracted through pain. They were legally classified not as people, but as property. Res, things, the same category as a table or a cart. And to make absolutely certain the population internalized its own helplessness, Rome staged its violence publicly. The arena was not entertainment in the way we use that word today. It was a political instrument, a weekly demonstration of what Roman power looked like when it was applied to a human body. Crucifixions along the roads, floggings in the forum, gladiatorial combat in stadiums that held more people than most modern sports arenas. The message broadcast from every seat to every watching eye was identical and unambiguous. This is what we do to those who resist. This is what we do for fun on a Tuesday. Imagine what we will do if you actually threaten us. It was a civilization built on a foundation of controlled terror. And it worked. For generations, it worked almost perfectly. Slave revolts happened, but they were local, disorganized, crushed quickly. The system had been refined over centuries to prevent exactly the kind of coordinated resistance that would be required to threaten Rome itself. There was one thing the system had not accounted for. What happens when you take a man, strip everything from him, train him to kill with professional precision, harden him against pain, teach him to read terrain and command men under pressure, and then leave him just enough dignity to remember what it felt like to be free? What happens when the machine builds the one thing it was designed to prevent? That question walked into a gladiatorial training school in Capua sometime around 73 BC, and Rome would spend the next 3 years discovering it had no good answer. Every legend has a before, a moment that existed before the chains, before the sand, before the screaming crowds. A life that was real and ordinary and completely invisible to the civilization that would later destroy it. Spartacus had a before, and Rome made absolutely certain you would never hear about it. The historical record on his origins is thin, deliberately thin, some historians argue. Roman writers who documented the war in detail somehow managed to say almost nothing about the man himself before he appeared in a slave market. His childhood, his family, his home, gone. As if a human being materialized out of nowhere, fully formed, already in chains. That erasure was not accidental. You do not give a dangerous idea a hometown. You do not give a rebellion a face that reminds people of their own fathers. But the fragments that survived point in one direction: Thrace. Thrace was a region that occupied roughly what is now Bulgaria, northern Greece, and parts of Turkey. It sat at the edge of the civilized world as Rome understood it, not a backwater, not a primitive wilderness. A place with its own kings, its own warrior traditions, its own gods, and its own fierce pride in remaining unconquered longer than most of Rome's other neighbours. The Thracians were not barbarians in the dismissive sense Romans used that word. They were simply people who had not yet been absorbed, people who still remembered what it meant to belong to themselves. The men who came from Thrace carried that memory in their bones. Spartacus was born into a culture where warfare was not a profession, it was an identity. Thracian boys grew up understanding weapons the way Roman boys grew up understanding politics. The curved blade, the small shield, the fighting style that emphasized speed and angles over brute force. These were not skills you learned in a training school. They were the language of the culture itself, spoken from childhood, fluent before adolescence. Ancient sources, fragmentary and biased as they are, suggest he may have served as an auxiliary soldier in the Roman army at some point. This detail, if true, is one of the most important and most overlooked facts in his entire story, because it means Rome did not just enslave a man, it enslaved a man it had already trained, a man who had marched with Roman legions, watched Roman commanders make decisions, understood Roman military structure from the inside. a man who knew exactly how the machine worked before the machine decided to own him. How he ended up in chains is not recorded with certainty. The most likely sequence is one Rome repeated thousands of times across its expanding borders. A military campaign, a defeated region, prisoners taken not as enemies to be executed, but as inventory to be processed. Men, women, children, sorted by age and physical condition, assigned values, loaded onto carts, and moved toward the nearest slave market. The transition from soldier to property could happen in a single afternoon. One lost battle, one unlucky position on the wrong side of a frontier Rome had decided to move. He had a wife, this much the sources confirm. A woman described as a prophetess from his own tribe, a woman who interpreted omens and was considered to possess the sight. She was enslaved alongside him, sold alongside him. She would remain with him through everything that followed, which tells you something about the kind of man he was before Rome got its hands on him. A woman with that kind of spiritual authority in Thracian culture did not stay beside a weak man. She stayed beside a man her gods had marked for something. What that something was, neither of them could have imagined yet. He arrived in Italy as a number in a ledger, a physical assessment, tall, strong, good musculature, excellent condition, potential value, high, destination, Capua. A gladiatorial training school owned by a man named Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Batiatus, a lanista, a word that sat just below the Latin word for butcher in terms of social respectability and just above it in terms of actual function. The man who had been a warrior, possibly a soldier, certainly a free human being with a name and a people and a homeland, walked through the gates of the ludus. The gates closed behind him, and the machine began its work. There is a moment that happens in every slave market that Roman writers never bothered to describe in detail, because to describe it honestly would require admitting what it actually was. Not a transaction, not commerce, not the orderly transfer of property between civilized men of business. It was the moment a human being was made to understand, through a series of precise and calculated humiliations, that everything they had ever been was now legally irrelevant. You were stripped, publicly, in front of buyers who walked around you the way a farmer walks around a horse at auction. They checked your teeth. They squeezed your muscles. They noted scars and assessed whether those scars indicated toughness or damage. They made you walk, turn, lift your arms. Potential buyers asked questions not to you, but about you, to the dealer standing beside you, as though you were not present, as though the body being examined had no interior, no history, no opinion about any of this. Then a price was agreed, coins changed hands, and you were handed a ceramic tag. The tag hung around your neck on a cord. It contained one sentence in Latin, a sentence that would define your entire legal existence from that moment forward. If found, return to your master. Not your name, not your origin, not any fact about who you actually were, just an address, just an instruction for whoever found you if you ran. You were now a thing with a return address. Spartacus passed through this process sometime around 73 BC and ended up at the Ludus in Capua, owned by Batiatus. Capua was the perfect city for this kind of business, rich, strategically located on the road between Rome and the south, famous for its luxury goods and its appetite for spectacle. The gladiatorial school there was one of the most prestigious in Italy, which meant it was one of the most brutal. Prestige in this context meant one thing: the men trained inside these walls died well. They died in ways that made 50,000 people lean forward in their seats. That was the product. That was what Batiatus was selling. The Ludus itself was a compound. High walls, iron gates, a training yard of packed dirt at the centre, barracks surrounding it on every side. The men who lived inside slept in cells barely large enough to lie down in. The cells had no windows. They were locked from the outside every night. During the day, guards watched from elevated positions around the perimeter. There was nowhere to go. There was nothing to do except train, eat, sleep, and wait for the next time someone decided your death would be entertaining. The food was calculated with the same cold precision as everything else in the system. Enough calories to maintain peak physical condition, enough protein to build and sustain the kind of muscle that looked impressive in an arena. Not one mouthful more. You were fed the way you would fuel a weapon you intended to use repeatedly. The moment your performance declined, the calculus changed. Weapons that no longer performed were discarded. New arrivals were assessed immediately. Physical capacity, fighting instincts, temperament. The lanista needed to know what he had purchased and what role it could fill. There were different classes of gladiator, each with specific weapons, specific armor, specific fighting styles, designed to create specific kinds of spectacle. The Thrakes fought with a curved blade and a small shield, using speed and footwork to create angles. The Murmillo carried a heavier shield and a short sword, relying on defense and controlled aggression. The Retiarius fought with a net and a trident, the most theatrical and most psychologically exposed of all, his body almost unarmored, visible to the crowd in a way that made every wound into a performance. When the trainers assessed Spartacus, what they saw confirmed what the slave dealer's notes had already suggested. This was not an ordinary purchase. The man moved like someone who had been fighting his entire life, not learning how to fight, but refining something already deeply embedded. His Thracian training translated directly, the curved blade, the emphasis on movement and angles, the instinct to create space and exploit openings rather than absorb punishment and grind forward. He was assigned to train as a Thraex, the fighting style closest to what he already knew. That decision, made for purely commercial reasons by a man thinking about ticket sales and arena contracts, would turn out to be one of the most consequential mistakes in Roman history. Because they did not just give Spartacus weapons, they gave him a curriculum. A daily, structured education in violence, tactics, physical conditioning, and the psychology of combat under extreme pressure. They taught him how Roman crowds responded to different kinds of fighting. They taught him how arena guards were positioned and why. They taught him the rhythms of the compound, the shift changes, the blind spots in the perimeter, the exact weight and reach of every weapon stored inside those walls. They trained him to be dangerous, and then locked him in a room with 60 other dangerous men and told him to wait. Rome had made this calculation thousands of times before, and it had always worked out. The men in the ludus were from different regions, different cultures, different languages. They had no shared identity, no common cause, no reason to trust each other. Divided men do not organize. Divided men survive individually and die individually, and the machine continues running. What Rome had not accounted for was a man who looked at a room full of divided, broken, isolated human beings and saw something else entirely. He saw an army that did not know it was an army yet. The ludus operated on a principle Rome never wrote down in any official document, but applied with absolute consistency across every gladiatorial school in Italy. The principle was simple. You do not need to break a man completely. You only need to break him enough. Leave him just enough physical strength to perform. Leave him just enough mental capacity to follow instructions. Remove everything else. Remove his name, his language, his gods, his relationships, his sense of future, his ability to imagine any reality beyond these walls. What remains is not a person. What remains is an instrument, useful, replaceable, disposable on a schedule determined entirely by someone else. The day inside the ludus began before sunrise. Guards moved through the corridors banging iron against stone. Men who had been sleeping on straw pallets in locked cells came awake in darkness, dressed in whatever they had, and filed into the training yard before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. The Capuan mornings were cold in winter, suffocating in summer. It made no difference. The schedule did not adjust for weather or illness or the psychological state of the men inside it. Training was conducted in rotations under the supervision of experienced fighters called doctores. These were men who had survived long enough in the arena to be given a different role, teaching rather than dying, though the line between the two was thinner than it appeared. They carried wooden staffs and used them freely. Technique failures were corrected physically. Hesitation was corrected physically. Any visible reluctance to inflict damage during sparring was noted, reported, and addressed with a reduction in food rations that could last days. The training weapons were wooden, heavy, dense, deliberately constructed to be significantly heavier than the iron versions they simulated. The logic was the same logic Roman legions applied to their own training. If you build your strength against resistance heavier than what you will face in combat, the real weapon will feel light in your hands. Your strikes will be faster, your endurance will last longer, you will perform better when it matters. The fact that performing better meant killing more efficiently was simply the commercial reality of the business. Spartacus trained alongside men from across the known world, Gauls with their size and aggression, Germans with their ferocity and threshold for pain, Greeks with their technical precision, Africans whose fighting traditions Rome had never encountered before absorbing their homelands. Men who had been soldiers, farmers, criminals, prisoners of war. Men who had been free 6 months ago and could still remember exactly what that felt like, which made them the most dangerous kind of slave, because memory is harder to confiscate than a weapon. The common language of the ludus was Latin by necessity, not because Rome imposed it as a cultural statement, but because it was the only tongue everyone shared, at least partially. And in that forced common language, something began to happen that the system was specifically designed to prevent. Men started talking to each other. Not openly. Not in the training yard where doctores watched and guards noted everything. In the cells at night, through walls thin enough to hear breathing. During the brief intervals between training rotations when supervision loosened for a few minutes. In the whispered exchanges over the communal meal that passed for dinner. Slowly, carefully, in the way that people communicate when they know that being overheard means punishment, and punishment in this context means something that leaves marks that last for weeks. They talked about where they came from. They talked about what had been taken from them. They talked, eventually, about the walls. The walls were high. The guards were positioned well. The gates were locked with mechanisms that required keys carried by specific men on specific rotations. A direct assault on the perimeter would fail, not because the gladiators lacked the physical capacity to overwhelm the guards. They almost certainly did not lack that capacity, but because the alarm would bring reinforcements from the city before they cleared the outer wall. Capua had a garrison. Rome had protocols for exactly this scenario. A slave rebellion contained within a single compound was a manageable problem. It had happened before. It had always been crushed before the fire could spread. What had never happened before was someone thinking 3 steps past the wall. Spartacus was not simply thinking about escape. He was thinking about what came after escape. Where do 60 trained killers go in the middle of Roman Italy with no supplies, no weapons beyond what they could carry, no allies, and every road in the peninsula monitored by a state apparatus that had been practicing the suppression of exactly this kind of problem for 200 years? Most men in that ludus, if they thought about escape at all, thought about running. Getting over the wall and disappearing into the countryside, alone or in small groups, hoping to reach a port or a border before the inevitable pursuit caught up with them. Spartacus was thinking about something Rome had never had to deal with before. He was thinking about not running at all. Before the escape, before the army, before Rome started using the word panic in its official correspondence, Spartacus fought in the arena. This part of the story gets skipped over quickly in most accounts because it is uncomfortable, because it complicates the clean narrative of the noble rebel, because it requires acknowledging that the man who would become the symbol of resistance against Roman brutality spent a period of his life performing that brutality for Roman entertainment. He killed people in the arena, real people, men with names and histories and families who had no more choice about being there than he did, and 50,000 Romans screamed with pleasure every time he did it well. Understanding this is not optional, because what the arena did to a man psychologically is inseparable from what Spartacus became afterward. The arena was not just physical training, it was a complete reconstruction of a human being's relationship with violence, with death, with fear, and with the crowd that controlled whether you lived or died on any given afternoon. The process began before you ever set foot in the sand. On the morning of a scheduled bout, the atmosphere inside the ludus changed. The routine shifted. The men who were scheduled to fight that day were fed differently, better, a final meal that everyone understood for exactly what it was. They were given access to bathing facilities normally restricted, small gestures of comfort that landed with the psychological weight of a last rite, because everyone in that compound understood that some percentage of the men receiving those gestures would not be eating dinner. The procession to the arena moved through the streets of Capua under guard. Citizens lined the route, some threw flowers, some shouted insults, some called out the names of fighters they had seen before and wagered on, the way a modern sports fan might acknowledge a familiar athlete. The men in that procession were simultaneously celebrated and degraded in the same gesture, admired for their physical perfection and despised for their social status, cheered as performers and regarded as less than human in every legal and social sense. Then the gates opened and the noise hit you. Nothing prepares a human nervous system for what 50,000 people screaming in an enclosed stone structure sounds like at close range. It is not loud the way a thunderstorm is loud. It is physical. You feel it in your chest, in the bones of your face, in the fluid behind your eyes. The sand under your feet is coarser than you expect, raked and smoothed over whatever happened here last week, which you know included blood, because the smell of it never fully leaves a place like this, regardless of how many times they rake the ground. Your opponent is already there, or enters from the opposite side. You have been told his name and his fighting style by your doctore. You have been given instructions. His left side is weak. He favors a particular sequence of 3 moves when he is pressured. He tires in the second quarter of a long bout and becomes reckless. Your job is to exploit these specific vulnerabilities in this specific ways that will create specific moments of dramatic spectacle for the crowd. Because the crowd is the client. The crowd paid for this, and what the crowd paid for was not a quick, efficient killing. What the crowd paid for was a story with a recognizable arc. The fight itself is nothing like the choreographed spectacles Rome's own paintings later depicted. It is exhausting, terrifying, painful, and frequently ugly. Sand gets into wounds. Weapons are heavier than they look from the seats. The impact of a shield bash travels up your entire arm and into your shoulder, and 2 days later, you still feel it. Men stumble, men make mistakes, men make sounds under duress that no one talks about afterward because those sounds are too human for a crowd that needs you to be something other than human. And in the middle of all of it, you are reading the crowd, because the crowd decides whether you live. If your opponent is down and incapacitated, and the fight is technically over, it is not your lanista who decides his fate. It is not the magistrate in the official seat. It is the noise coming from 50,000 throats, a turned thumb, a waved handkerchief, the crowd's pleasure or displeasure expressed in real time with your opponent's life as the currency. And you are watching it happen from inside the situation, calculating, adjusting, performing your own survival within the performance of someone else's death. Spartacus survived this, multiple times. The sources do not give us a fight record, but they confirm he was still alive and still fighting when the conspiracy inside the ludus began to take shape, which means he had navigated everything the arena threw at him and come out the other side. What it cost him internally, the sources do not record. But the man who emerged from repeated trips into that sand and back out again was not the same man who had walked through the gates of the ludus from a slave market in Capua. He had been educated in something Rome never intended to teach him. He had learned exactly how the crowd worked, how it could be manipulated, how it responded to spectacle and symbolism, and the carefully timed gesture that made tens of thousands of people feel something simultaneously. He had learned how to perform for an audience. That skill, extracted from the most degrading context imaginable, would prove to be one of the most powerful weapons he ever carried. The conspiracy did not begin with a speech. It did not begin with a manifesto or a declaration of principles or any of the dramatic gestures later storytellers attached to it. It began the way all genuinely dangerous things begin. Quietly, in the dark, between people who had decided that the cost of action was lower than the cost of continuing to do nothing. The core group that formed around Spartacus inside the Ludus included two men whose names survived the Roman attempt to erase this story. Crixus, a Gaul, large, ferocious, a fighter whose aggression in the arena had made him one of the most recognized gladiators in Capua. And Oenomaus, also Gallic, less documented but present in every account of the early conspiracy. These were not men Spartacus had recruited through persuasion. These were men who had arrived at the same conclusion independently and recognized in each other the particular quality that separates someone who talks about resistance from someone who actually intends it. The original plan was larger. The sources suggest that somewhere between 200 and the entire population of the Ludus were aware of or involved in the conspiracy at its peak. That number was its first vulnerability. 200 people sharing a secret inside a closed compound, monitored by guards whose entire professional function was detection of exactly this kind of coordination. The plan was betrayed, not through carelessness, but through the simple mathematics of human fear. Someone talked. Maybe they were threatened. Maybe they made a private calculation that survival under the current system was preferable to the consequences of a failed revolt. The details of who said what to whom are lost. What is not lost is the result. Word reached Batiatus. Guards were mobilized. The window was closing in real time. What happened next happened fast. Approximately 78 men did not wait for the guards to reach them. They moved to the kitchen, not to the armory, not to the gate, not to any of the obvious choke points the guards would already be covering. The kitchen. Because the kitchen contained something more immediately available than gladiatorial weapons. It contained cooking implements, cleavers, spits, knives, heavy, functional, already in hand. They fought their way out of the Ludus with kitchen tools. Think about what that sentence actually means. 78 men, some of the most physically conditioned and combat-trained individuals in Italy, overwhelmed professional guards using improvised weapons, breached a compound specifically designed to contain them, and got out. Not all of them. The sources suggest some were killed in the breakout, but enough to reach the road, enough to keep moving. On the road outside Capua, they encountered a piece of fortune that felt almost deliberate. A cart. Loaded with gladiatorial weapons being transported somewhere, to another school, to a storage facility. The destination does not matter. What matters is that 78 men who had just escaped with kitchen knives suddenly had access to the tools they had been trained their entire lives to use. They armed themselves from the cart and kept moving. They moved toward Mount Vesuvius. Vesuvius in 73 BC was not the catastrophic presence it would become 6 years later when it buried Pompeii under 20 feet of ash and changed the geography of southern Italy permanently. In 73 BC, it was simply a large dormant volcano covered in dense forest and wild vines rising sharply from the flat agricultural plain of Campania. Difficult terrain, difficult to approach in force, difficult to encircle completely, given the size and complexity of the slopes. For a small group of escaped slaves with no food, no shelter, no allies, and every Roman authority in the region already mobilizing against them, it was as close to a defensible position as the Italian landscape offered. They went up. Rome's initial response revealed exactly how seriously it did not take this situation. The Senate did not dispatch a legion. It did not mobilize a consular army. It sent a praetor named Gaius Claudius Glaber with approximately 3,000 men, not soldiers in the formal military sense, but a hastily assembled militia to surround the base of the mountain and wait. The logic was straightforward, and in almost any other scenario would have been correct. You do not need to fight men on a mountain, you need to starve them off it. Cut off their access to food and water, wait for desperation to do your work for you, and arrest whoever comes down thin and broken enough to stop fighting. Glaber set up his camp at the only obvious path down from the summit and waited. He had made one catastrophic assumption. He had assumed that a group of escaped slaves would think like escaped slaves. Frightened, reactive, focused entirely on immediate survival. He had not accounted for the possibility that the man at the top of that mountain was thinking like a general. Spartacus looked at the volcanic slopes around him and noticed something Glaber had not bothered to consider. The wild vines covering the mountain were long, strong, and abundant. He set his men to work cutting and braiding them into ropes, long enough to descend a cliff face. At night, his entire force went over the edge of a cliff that Glaber's camp had dismissed as impassable. They descended in darkness, silently, landed on the slope below the Roman position, moved around behind the camp, and attacked from the direction no one was watching. Glaber's militia did not have time to form a defensive line. They ran. They abandoned their camp, their equipment, their food supplies, and their weapons, all of which now belonged to Spartacus. Rome had sent 3,000 men to contain 78 escaped gladiators. 78 escaped gladiators had just destroyed 3,000 men and helped themselves to everything left behind. That night, on the slopes of Vesuvius, the nature of this situation changed completely. This was no longer a slave escape. This was no longer a problem for a local praetor with a militia. Something new had entered the world, something Rome had no existing category for, and word of what had happened on that mountain moved faster than any Roman messenger could ride. Across the fields of Campania, in the slave quarters of every farm and estate within a day's walk, men and women who had spent years memorizing the dimensions of their own helplessness heard what had happened at Vesuvius. And they started walking toward the mountain. They came at night, mostly, slipping away from farms and estates in ones and twos and small groups, moving through the darkness along paths they had memorized over years of forced labor, carrying almost nothing because there was almost nothing to carry. Agricultural slaves, household slaves, men who had never held a weapon in their lives, walking through the Italian countryside toward a mountain where someone had done the impossible and survived it. Within weeks of the breakout, the force on and around Vesuvius had grown from 78 to several thousand. This created a problem that Spartacus had to solve immediately, or watch the entire enterprise collapse under its own weight. Because several thousand people is not an army. Several thousand people from different countries, speaking different languages, with different physical capacities, different levels of desperation, and almost no military experience between most of them, is a crowd. A crowd is slower than a single man, louder than a single man, harder to feed than a single man, and, in a military confrontation, it dies faster than a single man because it does not move with a single intention. Rome had legions. A legion was not just a large number of soldiers, it was a system. Centuries of refinement had produced a military organism that could march 30 miles a day, carrying 60 pounds of equipment, build a fortified camp at the end of that march, wake up the next morning and fight a disciplined engagement, and do all of this in coordination with several other legions operating simultaneously across a wide geographic area. The men inside a Roman legion had trained together, drilled together, and understood a shared vocabulary of commands and formations that allowed thousands of individuals to function as a single entity in the chaos of combat. Spartacus had none of that infrastructure. He had people. Raw, traumatized, determined people, but people who had to be turned into something capable of standing against the most effective military machine the ancient world had ever produced. He had to do it fast, in the open, with no training facilities, no supply lines, no institutional support of any kind. What he had instead was a quality Rome consistently underestimated in the people it enslaved. He had men who had nothing left to lose. And men who have nothing left to lose are the most dangerous raw material in the world if someone knows how to shape them. He began with what he knew. Gladiatorial training is not military training, but it is not unrelated to it either. The fundamentals of individual combat, footwork, timing, the management of fear under pressure, the ability to continue functioning when your body is telling you to stop, these things transfer. He put his experienced fighters, the gladiators who had escaped with him, to work training the new arrivals, not to fight like gladiators, to fight like soldiers. He organized his growing force into units, small enough to be commanded effectively, large enough to be tactically useful. He assigned men to roles based on what they could do, rather than what they were supposed to be able to do. Former soldiers from conquered territories, men who had served in various armies before Rome absorbed their homelands, were given command responsibilities immediately. Their experience was worth more than any supply of weapons. The weapons problem was solved through a method Rome had not anticipated and could not easily counter. Spartacus did not try to manufacture weapons or acquire them through a supply chain he did not have. He took them from Rome. Every Roman force sent against him became a weapons depot the moment it was defeated. The militia at Vesuvius had provided the first installment. Subsequent engagements provided more. His men melted down the chains that many of them were still wearing when they arrived and reforged the iron into blades. They took the agricultural tools from the farms they moved through, the heavy implements used for harvesting and land clearing, and adapted them for combat. They were not well equipped by Roman standards, but they were progressively better equipped with each engagement. Rome sent a second force, another praetor, Publius Varinius, with a more substantial army. The engagement that followed demonstrated something that began to appear in Roman military correspondence with increasing frequency over the following months, a quality that Roman commanders consistently failed to account for until it was too late. Spartacus could read a battlefield. Not in the way a trained Roman officer read a battlefield, through the lens of established doctrine and standard formations and the accumulated tactical vocabulary of the legions. He read it differently. He read it the way someone reads a situation when they have no playbook to fall back on, and survival depends on finding the solution that exists in this specific terrain, on this specific day, against this specific opponent. He used ground the way his men had once used the cliffs of Vesuvius. He created situations where Roman numerical and equipment advantages became irrelevant or even liabilities. He hit flanks. He used night movement. He feigned retreat in ways that pulled Roman formations out of their disciplined structure and into the chaotic close-quarters engagement where his fighters' individual ferocity compensated for their lack of formal training. Varinius was not just defeated, he was humiliated. Spartacus captured his horse, his lictors, the ceremonial symbols of his official Roman authority. These were not taken as trophies in any personal sense, they were taken as symbols, displayed publicly, sent as a message to every slave on every farm in southern Italy that could see them or hear about them. The message was not subtle. Rome's representatives can be defeated. Rome's symbols can be captured. Rome itself is not invincible. By the end of 73 BC, the force that had escaped a gladiatorial school with kitchen knives had grown into an army of somewhere between 40 and 70,000 people. It controlled significant territory in southern Italy. It had defeated multiple Roman military forces in open engagements. It was moving through the Italian countryside with a freedom of action that should have been impossible for an army with no supply infrastructure, no political support, no city walls to retreat behind, and no established state funding its operations. And it was still growing. Rome was no longer sending praetors. Rome was having a different kind of conversation now. The kind that happens in the Senate, when comfortable men who have spent their careers managing comfortable problems suddenly realize they are looking at something that does not fit any of their existing categories. The word they kept using in their deliberations, the word that appears in the sources with uncomfortable frequency, was not rebellion, was not uprising, was not the standard vocabulary Rome used for slave disturbances that could be managed with a garrison and some crucifixions. The word they kept using was war. Every revolution has a fracture running through it from the very beginning, a line so thin at first that you cannot see it. A difference in vision, in temperament, in what the whole enterprise is actually for. The fracture in Spartacus's army had a name, two names actually, Crixus, and the argument about what this army was supposed to do next. Crixus had been there from the beginning. He had been part of the core conspiracy in the Ludus. He had fought his way out with the others, climbed Vesuvius, descended the cliff on braided vines, overwhelmed Glaber's camp in the dark. His courage was beyond question. His ferocity in combat was legendary, even inside an army that contained some of the most physically dangerous individuals in Italy. The Roman sources, which had every reason to diminish everyone on Spartacus's side, describe him with a respect they cannot quite suppress. But Crixus and Spartacus did not agree on what winning looked like. Spartacus's strategic thinking, reconstructed from the movements of his army and the few fragments of his reasoning that survived in Roman accounts, pointed consistently northward. The Alps. Cross the Alps, disperse into Gaul and Thrace and Germania, let the army dissolve back into the territories it came from. Most of these people had homelands they remembered, children and parents and pieces of life that had been stolen and might, in some version of events that did not seem completely insane, from the top of a mountain in southern Italy, be recovered. The logic was sound. Rome could not easily pursue a dispersed force across the Alps into territories it did not control. The army of slaves could not govern territory, could not maintain supply lines indefinitely, could not win a long war of attrition against a state with essentially infinite resources and the institutional memory of 200 years of military refinement. Getting out was the only realistic path to anything resembling survival for the people who made up this force. Crixus did not want to get out. Crixus wanted to fight, not as a means to an end, as the point. The Romans had done something to him, to all of them, that could not be addressed by crossing a mountain range and going home. There was a debt, a specific, concrete, personal debt that could only be settled in one currency, and that currency was available in abundance in the farms and towns of southern Italy, where Roman power had been humiliating people like him for generations. His argument found a willing audience, because a significant portion of the army had no home to return to. Men born into slavery in Italy who had never seen the territories their parents came from. Men whose families were still enslaved on Roman estates within marching distance. Men who had been so thoroughly processed by Roman civilization that the idea of dispersing back into some ancestral homeland was as abstract as a rumor. For them, north was not freedom. North was just a different kind of nowhere. The army stayed together, but the fracture widened. In early 72 BC, Crixus separated from the main force. He took approximately 30,000 men, a substantial fraction of the total army, and moved independently through the region of Apulia in southeastern Italy. He was not retreating from Spartacus. He was pursuing his own version of what this war was for. Rome sent 2 consular armies after him. A consular army was not a praetor's militia. It was not a hastily assembled force of semi-trained civilians. It was the full institutional weight of the Roman military system, commanded by men who held the highest elected office in the Republic, backed by the Senate's full authority and resources. 2 of them, deployed simultaneously, against one part of a fractured slave army operating without the tactical genius that had kept the main force intact. Crixus fought. The battle near Mount Garganus in Apulia was decisive and catastrophic. The Roman consular armies encircled his force and destroyed it with the systematic efficiency the legions brought to engagements where they held every structural advantage. Crixus died in the fighting. 30,000 people who had been free for less than a year were killed or recaptured. The ones recaptured were crucified along the roads as a demonstration. Ennomaus had already died in an earlier engagement, details unrecorded, present in the sources only as an absence where a name used to be. 3 commanders had started this together. One was dead in a battle Rome had engineered specifically to exploit the fracture in the army. One had vanished from the record, and one remained. Spartacus received word of Crixus's death and did something the Roman sources record with a detail they clearly found disturbing. He held funeral games. In the Roman tradition, the death of a great man was honoured with gladiatorial combat. Men fought and died in the dead man's honour. Spartacus forced Roman prisoners to fight each other to the death in honour of Crixus. He took the most Roman of all Roman rituals, the spectacle that had defined his own degradation, and turned it inside out. Roman men performing for his audience, Roman men dying for his commemoration. It was not grief, it was not sentimentality, it was a statement delivered in the only language Rome had ever used with him. Then he turned his army north and started moving toward the Alps. He won, repeatedly. He defeated both consular armies that had destroyed Crixus, which means he defeated the highest level of Roman military force the Republic could deploy. He moved through northern Italy with an army that had now grown back to somewhere near 100,000 people. The Alps were ahead of him. The path he had always believed was the only rational exit was within reach. And then, for reasons that have puzzled historians for 2,000 years, he stopped. He turned around. He marched back south. Rome did not panic easily. It was a civilization that had survived Hannibal crossing the Alps with war elephants, watched 3 consular armies destroyed at Cannae in a single afternoon, endured civil wars and political assassinations and plagues and fires and 100 other catastrophes that would have dissolved most states within a generation. Roman institutional memory was long, and its capacity for absorbing disaster without existential collapse was genuinely remarkable. But in 72 BC, Rome panicked. The Senate's deliberations during this period, reconstructed from later accounts, have a quality of controlled hysteria underneath the formal language. The vocabulary shifts, the tone changes, because the thing they were dealing with no longer fit the category they had tried to put it in. This was not a slave disturbance. This was not a regional security problem to be managed by praetors with militia forces. This was a war being conducted on Italian soil, within striking distance of Rome itself, by an army that had just defeated the consular forces the Republic had sent to destroy it. The streets of Rome were not calm. Citizens who had spent their entire lives inside a system that made Roman power feel permanent and absolute were confronting a possibility the system had always insisted was impossible. The slaves could win. The slaves were winning. And the city that sat at the centre of the most powerful empire on earth suddenly felt very large and very exposed, and surrounded on all sides by people who had every reason in the world to want to see it burn. The Senate needed someone. Not a competent commander, not a reliable general. Someone willing to take on an assignment that had already destroyed the careers and reputations of every Roman officer who had attempted it. Someone with enough resources to field a force large enough to end this, enough ruthlessness to do what ending it would actually require, and enough political insulation to absorb the risk of failure without bringing the entire Senate down with him. They found Marcus Licinius Crassus. Crassus was the wealthiest man in Rome, possibly the wealthiest man in the known world. His fortune had been built through methods that even his contemporaries found distasteful, which in Rome was a meaningful threshold to cross. He had purchased burning buildings from their panicking owners at fractions of their value, and then used his private fire brigade to extinguish them. He had profited from the prescriptions of Sulla, buying the property of the executed and the exiled at catastrophic discounts. He owned silver mines, agricultural estates, urban real estate across Italy, and a network of trained slaves he rented out as skilled laborers to other wealthy Romans. He was not beloved. He was not even particularly respected in the way Roman aristocracy respected military achievement. He was feared in the specific way that a man with unlimited resources and no obvious moral constraints is feared by people who understand what unlimited resources can purchase. He wanted the command, not because he felt any particular urgency about the slave problem, but because Crassus had spent his entire career watching men like Pompey and Julius Caesar accumulate the political capital that came with military glory, and he understood that the man who ended this war would own a piece of Roman political history that money alone could not buy. He negotiated his terms with the Senate and got what he asked for. 6 new legions, permission to recall 2 additional legions that had been serving under the failed consular commanders, a force of somewhere between 40 and 50,000 trained soldiers with full equipment, supply lines, and the institutional backing of the Roman state. The largest army assembled on Italian soil in a generation. Assembled for one purpose. There is probably truth in this. An army that follows you voluntarily is not the same as an army that obeys orders under threat of decimation. Spartacus could not simply command his force to march north and expect compliance the way Crassus could command his legions. The social contract holding his army together was different, more fragile in some ways, more powerful in others, but fundamentally dependent on his men believing that the direction he pointed them was a direction worth following. If enough of them pointed south, he may have had no practical choice. But there is another possibility that the sources dance around without ever stating directly. A possibility that requires taking seriously the idea that Spartacus was thinking about something beyond the immediate survival of the people under his command. He had spent 3 years demonstrating that Roman power was not invincible. He had done it repeatedly, publicly, in engagements that could not be explained away or minimized. Word of what he had accomplished had traveled across the entire Mediterranean world. In the slave quarters of Greece, of North Africa, of Asia Minor, of every territory Rome had absorbed and every territory it had not yet reached, people knew the name Spartacus. People knew what had happened in southern Italy. People knew that the thing Rome had always insisted was impossible had turned out to be possible. What happens if he keeps going? What happens if, instead of crossing the Alps and dissolving into the landscape, he drives his army toward Rome itself? What happens to the idea of Roman invincibility if a slave army stands outside the walls of the city that had built the entire apparatus of human ownership? Not necessarily winning, not necessarily sacking Rome and rewriting the political map of the Mediterranean, but standing there, visible, real, undeniable. What does that do to every slave in every Roman household, farm and mine across the known world? We cannot know if this is what Spartacus was thinking. The sources do not give us his interior. They give us his movements, and they give us the results of those movements, and they leave the reasoning almost entirely blank. Roman writers had every incentive to portray him as a man driven by base instincts, by bloodlust, by the chaos that Romans associated with people they considered uncivilized. The idea that he turned around because of a strategic vision that operated on a scale beyond the immediate military situation was not a story Rome wanted told. What we know is what he did. He marched south. He fought through Crassus's attempts to intercept him. He sought allies he believed he had secured. He made decisions that only make sense if the objective was something larger than personal escape. And one by one, every piece of that larger plan fell apart. The first piece was the Samnites. The people of Samnium had their own long and brutal history with Rome, a series of wars spanning generations in which Rome had systematically dismantled their independence and absorbed their territory. The logic of an alliance was obvious. Two groups with grievances against the same enemy, one with a mobile army that had already demonstrated its capacity, one with territorial knowledge and potential additional resources. Spartacus appears to have calculated on Samnite support. It did not materialize. The Samnites had been broken too thoroughly and too recently. The memory of what Rome did to populations that resisted it was too fresh. They did not rise. The second piece was the slaves of Sicily. The island had already experienced two massive slave revolts in living memory, both of which had required significant Roman military effort to suppress. The population of enslaved people in Sicily was enormous, agricultural, and had every reason in the world to respond to the example Spartacus had set. If Sicily rose simultaneously with the mainland force, Rome would face a two-front crisis it could not easily manage. Sicily did not rise. The slave owners of Sicily, having lived through two previous revolts, had spent the intervening years implementing exactly the kind of preventive terror that made coordinated action impossible. The island stayed quiet. The third piece was the pirates. And the pirates were where everything broke. The Cilician pirates were the largest and most organized naval force in the Mediterranean that did not belong to a recognized state. They operated out of the rocky coastline of southern Asia Minor, controlled significant stretches of sea lanes, raided Roman shipping with a regularity that had become a standing embarrassment to the Republic, and maintained a commercial relationship with essentially anyone who had money and cargo and no particular loyalty to Roman trade interests. Spartacus needed ships. Specifically, he needed enough ships to transport a substantial force across to Sicily, where he believed the existing enslaved population would rise to join him if he could get enough of his army onto the island to provide the spark. The Cilicians had ships. They also had, as far as anyone could determine, no love for Rome and no particular reason to refuse a transaction. He negotiated with them. The sources do not give us the details of the negotiation, but the broad outline is clear. Transport. In exchange for whatever combination of valuables his army had accumulated through 3 years of raiding Roman estates and defeating Roman forces. Gold, silver, goods. His army had been moving through some of the wealthiest agricultural territory in Italy. They were not without resources. The pirates took the payment, then they sailed away. Just that. No confrontation, no last-minute military intervention, no dramatic reversal. They took what Spartacus offered them and left him standing on the shore of the Strait of Messina, looking at water with no way across it, and Crassus's army closing in behind him. Whether they were bribed by Rome is not established with certainty in the sources. Some historians argue yes, that Crassus, or someone acting on Rome's behalf, had made a counter-offer substantial enough to override whatever arrangement Spartacus thought he had secured. Others argue the pirates simply made a cold calculation that a slave army, regardless of its impressive recent record, was not a stable, long-term commercial partner, and that maintaining their relationship with Roman trade interests was worth more than any single transaction. The motive does not change the outcome. The ships were gone. Sicily was unreachable. The flanking strategy that might have transformed a contained military campaign into an existential crisis for Rome was finished before it started. Spartacus attempted to cross the strait on rafts. His men built them from whatever timber and materials were available on the shore. The strait is not wide, but it is deep, and the currents are strong and unpredictable. The attempt failed. The rafts were not seaworthy enough for the conditions. Men drowned. The crossing was abandoned. He was now in the position Crassus had been engineering for months, trapped in the south of Italy with his back to water he could not cross, a fortified wall and a disciplined army to his north, no external allies who had delivered on their promises, and an army that had been moving and fighting for 3 years and was beginning to show the specific kind of exhaustion that no amount of courage or tactical brilliance can indefinitely compensate for. He attempted to break through Crassus's line. His first attempt failed. The fortifications held. Men died against the earthworks without breaching them. A second attempt, conducted in winter conditions that the sources describe as brutal even by Italian standards, succeeded partially. He forced a gap in the line and pushed a portion of his army through. It was not the clean breakout he needed. The force that made it through the wall was not his entire army. The cohesion that had kept his force functioning as a unified military organism was fraying under the accumulated pressure of containment, failed alliances, and the specific despair that sets in when a sequence of rational plans produces irrational outcomes. And then Rome added a weight that Crassus had not even needed to request. Pompey was coming. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, who would eventually become 1/3 of the first triumvirate alongside Crassus and Caesar, was returning to Italy from Spain, where he had been managing his own military campaigns. The Senate, deciding that the situation in the south required absolute certainty of conclusion, ordered Pompey to redirect his forces to assist in the final suppression of the revolt. This was simultaneously a military reinforcement and a political threat directed at Crassus personally. If Pompey arrived and participated in the final defeat of Spartacus, the glory of ending the war would be shared or stolen entirely. Crassus had spent enormous personal resources on this campaign. He had accepted the political risk of an assignment every previous commander had failed. He was not going to hand the prize to Pompey. He needed to end this before Pompey's legions crossed into the theatre of operations. Spartacus understood that the walls were closing from every direction simultaneously. His options had been reduced one by one with a methodical patience he recognized, because it was the same patience the ludus had once applied to him. Reduce the space, control the exits, wait for desperation to produce the mistake you need. He had one option remaining that was not a retreat, not a surrender, not a slow death by attrition inside a shrinking perimeter. He could walk straight at Crassus. He could take everything he had left, every man still capable of holding a weapon, and drive directly into the Roman force that had been hunting him for months. Not to survive, not to escape, not to execute the larger strategic vision that the pirates had made impossible, but to make the ending of this story cost Rome something it would feel for a generation. He had been making the same calculation since a gladiatorial school in Capua. Every situation the system put him in, the answer was always the same. Do not wait for the walls to finish closing. Move first. Move toward the thing that is trying to kill you and make it pay for the attempt. He made his decision. He gathered his commanders. He told them what the next day would look like. He gave them the only honest assessment he had ever given anyone who followed him. They were not going to win this battle, but they were going to make Rome remember it forever. The Senate also authorized something else, something that reveals the specific quality of fear Spartacus had generated in the Roman governing class. They gave Crassus the authority to restore an ancient punishment called decimation. The practice of selecting one soldier in 10 from a unit that had shown cowardice or failed in its duty and executing him in front of his surviving comrades. Not as a punishment for a specific act, as a message, as a recalibration of what the soldiers in this army were more afraid of. Crassus needed his men to be more frightened of failing him than they were of Spartacus. Decimation was his chosen instrument for that recalibration. He applied it almost immediately. One of the disgraced legions from the earlier failed campaigns made a tactical error or showed insufficient aggression in an early engagement. The sources disagree on the specific trigger. The result was not in dispute. Crassus had the unit assembled. He had every 10th man selected by lot. He had them beaten to death by their own comrades while the rest of the legion watched. 500 men died that day, not in battle, but as a message. The message was received. Crassus began his campaign with a methodical patience that was the precise opposite of every Roman commander who had faced Spartacus before him. He did not chase, he did not seek the decisive engagement that his predecessors had consistently lost. He constructed. He built a fortified line across the toe of Italy, a wall of earth and trenches and stakes stretching coast to coast, designed not to defeat Spartacus directly, but to contain him. To reduce the problem from a mobile war, where Spartacus's tactical genius was the decisive factor, to a siege where Roman resources and Roman endurance were the decisive factor. Trap the army, starve it, let mathematics do what legions had failed to do. And for a time, it worked. Spartacus found himself in a position that mirrored, with terrible irony, the position of the men he had commanded for 3 years. Surrounded, cut off from free movement, watching the walls close in, facing the specific kind of pressure that the system had always used against people like him. He had broken out of a ludus with kitchen knives. Now he had to break out of Italy with 100,000 people and the most ruthless man in Rome standing between him and anything resembling a future. This is the question that has sat at the center of the Spartacus story for 2,000 years. The question Roman historians glossed over because the honest answer was too uncomfortable. The question modern scholars argue about in footnotes and academic conferences without ever quite resolving it. Because it does not have a clean answer. And the absence of a clean answer tells you more about Spartacus than any answer could. He was at the Alps. His army had just destroyed 2 consular forces. Northern Italy lay behind him, battered and shocked. The mountain passes were ahead. Gaul was on the other side. Freedom, in the most literal geographic sense, was within reach. The strategy he had consistently argued for, the strategy that represented the only rational long-term path to survival for the people who followed him, was executable. He turned around. The sources offer explanations that feel incomplete the moment you examine them. Some suggest his army refused to go, that the men who had no homeland to return to, the Italian-born slaves, the men whose entire world was contained within the peninsula, simply would not march north into territories that meant nothing to them, that Spartacus was overruled by the democratic weight of 100,000 people who wanted to stay and fight. The night before the final battle, Spartacus called for his horse, his personal horse, the animal that marked him as commander above every other man in the field. He took it by the bridle, drew his blade, and killed it himself, in front of his men, without ceremony. "If we win," he told them, "I will have all the horses of Rome. If we lose, I will not need one." No false comfort, no performed confidence designed to hold morale together through optimism he did not feel. Just the truth, delivered in the blunt Thracian way he had never abandoned, regardless of how many years Rome had spent trying to process it out of him. They were probably not going to win this battle, but they were going to make Rome pay for it, in a currency the Republic would feel for a generation. His men had been following him for 3 years, not because he promised them survival, because of what following him had always actually meant. The specific dignity of choosing how you face the thing that is coming for you. The refusal to wait inside a shrinking perimeter for the walls to finish closing. They had descended a cliff in the dark with braided vines. They had destroyed a militia with kitchen knives. They had broken consular armies in open field engagements that no Roman military theorist could fully explain afterward. They had done all of it together, following a man who had never once pointed them towards something safe. He was not pointing them towards something safe now, either. The army that assembled that morning was not what it had been. 3 years of continuous war. The loss of Crixus and 30,000 men, the failed crossing, the winter behind Crassus's wall, the pirates who took the payment and sailed away. All of it had ground the numbers and the energy down to something leaner and rawer and more desperate than the force that had swept through southern Italy like a fire 2 years earlier. but they were still there. Every man still standing, still capable of forward motion, still carrying whatever weapon remained to them. He organized them, assigned the flanks, positioned his most experienced fighters at the center, gave one final instruction to every commander in the line. Find Crassus. Not his officers, not his standard-bearers, the man himself. The man who had built the wall and applied the patient pressure and turned this into a siege because he understood that Spartacus could not be beaten in open movement. The man who had chosen to own this war because he wanted the glory of ending it. Spartacus wanted to end it differently. Then he started walking toward the Roman lines. The battle happened in Lucania in 71 BC. The exact location is still disputed. The sequence of events assembled from accounts written by men who were not there and had every reason to shape the ending Rome needed. Spartacus drove his force straight into the Roman lines. No maneuvering, no feints. Forward, at full force, with the specific intensity of men who have decided the only remaining variable they control is how hard they hit before they go down. The Roman legions held. Crassus had drilled and threatened and decimated them into exactly the kind of rigid institutional discipline that could absorb this kind of assault without fracturing. The machinery worked the way Roman military machinery worked when it was properly assembled and properly afraid of its commander. Spartacus fought toward the center, toward Crassus. He killed 2 centurions who stood between him and the Roman command. He was wounded. He kept moving. He went to one knee at some point, still fighting from the ground, sword still in his hand, still facing forward. He did not reach Crassus. The sources record his death in a single sentence. He fell in the fighting. No final words, no dramatic image of a specific blow. He was in the front of his army, moving toward the thing trying to kill him, and then he was gone.